Hi, I'm Dawn Cavanaugh, APQS Education Director. Sometimes we make quilts where adding traditional binding just doesn't feel like the right thing to do. A modern quilt or contemporary quilt, for example, often feels like the binding shouldn't stop your eye as it takes in all of the perimeter of the quilt. My wall hanging is another great example. The polar bears here look great, but adding a traditional binding like you see along the edge seems to make our eyes stop right there. We lose that ethereal feeling of looking at this scene as if it was flowing out onto the wall. So today I'm going to show you a technique called facing. It allows us to take the raw edge of the quilt where we'd normally add that binding, that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and turn that seam allowance on the back side of the quilt. That way it will look like the design or the theme continues all the way out to the edge with no visual break to disturb our view. Let's take a look. With this technique, we are still going to sew our facing strip on the right side of the quilt, but then we will be flipping it so that this entire edge gets folded back along with the facing strip. So you want to choose a facing color that actually blends well with your project, remembering that it might slightly be visible from the sides, but normally it will be completely hidden. You can choose to do a single fold type of a facing where you fold over a 1/2 inch or more and press it so that once it's sewn on and flipped to the back, you will be able to hand stitch this down on the rear of the quilt. Or you can use a traditional double fold fabric if you feel that you need a little more stability. I personally use this one a little bit more frequently simply because for me it helps me to keep everything stable as I'm hand sewing the facing to the back. So the main difference is that we are not going to be wrapping this around the edge, but we're actually going to be using it to fold the entire quilt edge back with us. Unlike traditional binding where we make all of our strips into one continuous piece, with facing, we're going to cut 4 strips, 1 for each side of the quilt. Make sure that your strips are at least 2 inches longer on each side of the quilt. So for example, my quilt is about 42 inches tall. I'm going to cut a strip that's 46 inches long so that I have extension on both ends. I'm also going to show you a little trick on how to finish the edges. You can actually take a square of fabric, cut it out. The size is kind of dependent upon the size of the quilt you're going to hang. And then we're going to fold it in half. This happens to be a 6-inch square that I folded along the diagonal and pressed. I'm going to use those out here on the corners. When I'm turning the quilt around, then it's going to help hide those corners if I'm not real confident about how they're going to come together. But it even helps to make it an easy hanging sleeve by inserting a dowel or a piece of lumber in the back. I can hang the quilt without having any visual hangers present. To attach the facing to my quilt, I'm going to use a foot that actually has a little flange out here on the outer edge next to that 1/4 inch. That's going to allow me to guide the quilt edge along with the facing edge very consistently all along as I attach it. We are also going to need to do some top stitching to help the quilt top and the facing roll to the back of the quilt. Now, some machines have something similar to this foot. This is actually a stitch in the ditch foot for my machine. It's got a flange that is right in the center, which normally rides right along the ditch. If you have this type of foot, you might be able to use it to stitch along the outer edge doing our stay stitching. However, mine is not going to work because it has a small single needle hole normally used for quilting. And for this to work for this technique, I need to be able to scoot the needle over a little bit so that this rides in the seam and the needle is slightly to the right of that. That's going to make a little more sense here when we attach the facing and flip it to the back. But I wanted to point out those differences for you just in case you're wondering if that particular foot in your set will work for you. I'm going to start on the short edge of my quilt, and I'm going to leave that little extra extension hanging past the edge of the quilt, about 1.5 inches or so. Next, as I stitch onto the quilt top itself, I am going to do some back stitches to help secure this so that it doesn't pull apart once we flip this to the back side. That's really important to help keep those edges nice and secure. Simply keep working all the way along. Make sure that, again, if your quilting doesn't leave the edge of your quilt or you're concerned about puckering, use that walking foot to help attach this piece straight and nice and even without ruffles. When you get to the other edge of your quilt top, remember to do those back stitches. That's very important. So I'm going to attach a strip just like this to the opposite short side of the quilt. After you've attached your facing to two opposite ends of the quilt, it's okay to then go ahead and trim the facing even with the edge of the quilt. Just make sure that you've done your back stitching first so that it can't come apart once we flip this around to the back side. The next step is to take the quilt to your ironing board and carefully press the facing away from the top of the quilt. If you're using a single fold facing, you will have attached it this way with a single fold facing up, so that when you rotate it to the back, it will be facing down. Just be careful as you press to maintain that crisp edge. That's what you'll be using to sew this down on the back side by hand. Well, while I'm waiting for my iron to heat up, here are a couple of other tips I'd like to share with you. The first is that if you're concerned at all that your quilting edge, for example, if your quilting didn't leave the edge of the quilt, or you've got a lot of fullness out there, if you're concerned that that might ruffle a little bit, use straight of grain facing strips. That will help to stabilize that and make sure that even as this quilt is hanging on your wall, it won't sag over time. The second tip is that I use a wool pressing mat, especially for this technique. It allows that extra seam allowance there, that extra bulk to sink in, giving me a really good crisp edge, because we're going to turn this whole piece back so that it's not visible. So I want to make sure that I get as straight and crisp of edge as possible. I also personally use steam to help keep that in place. Be sure that as you are pressing, you actually do press and not iron back and forth, which can distort your facing. Lift and fold, lift and press. It helps to let your section cool just a little bit before you move it to the next area, also to help prevent some distortion. The next step is really important to helping get that seam allowance to fold over. We've got all the batting and the backing to twist to the back of the quilt as well. So we're going to use a technique that tailors and dressmakers use to help the facings of necklines and armholes turn nicely to the underside. We're going to do a top stitch all the way along our facing, right next to the crease that we just made as we pressed that facing over, roughly about 1/8 of an inch in. Since I don't have a foot, that will allow me to ride that ridge right along this folded edge. I've switched to an open toe foot so that I have great visibility, but it's got a center mark, so I can run that center mark right along the folded edge of our facing. And then I moved my needle 3 steps to the right of center. So even though I'm guiding the fabric along the seam here, this fold, then the needle is going to sew just to the right edge of that. We're going to do this on both sides of the quilt. Then I'll show you how to turn this to the back. So with that, stay stitching all the way along the folded edge of the facing. It's going to allow the quilt to roll beautifully all the way over to the back side. It's going to make a nice crisp edge. Then we'll be able to hand sew that down later. The next step is to take this to my ironing board. I am going to press that all the way along to get that good crisp edge. And then I am going to baste the edge down where the raw edges of our first two pieces meet the raw edge of the quilt. That's going to hold it in place as I add the left and right sides to the quilt edge. I'm going to press with the wrong or back side of the quilt facing up so that I can clearly roll this over and make sure that everything is flipping the way I want it to and getting a nice straight edge. I'm still using steam so that I can help set that fold all the way along the top edge of the quilt. I've run a basting stitch just about 1/8 of an inch in from the raw edge of the quilt, just enough to hold these first two edges down and even before I attach the left and the right sides. Already the top two edges are looking awesome and we haven't even done the sides. So you can see what that's going to do to make our quilt look pretty spectacular without binding. Let's add the two sides so we can see how it looks. To attach these remaining two sides, I have switched back to the foot that's got the little flange on the outside edge at that 1/4 inch level to help me keep the edge of the quilt nice and straight along with the facing. And because I had adjusted my needle, it's important to make sure that if you've done that, you put that back into the center position for attaching this. Ask me how I know. If you forget, you're going to end up breaking a needle. So with that back in the center position, I am going to make sure that I do back stitching right here at the edge of the quilt when I attach this outside strip. Also, make sure that you have lots of extra on each end of this strip because this is not going to get cut off. This is going to help make our corner look nice and neat when we turn it to the back side. So I'm going to get these two sides attached and then let's take a look at how you handle those corners. Be sure to do your back stitch as you enter the quilt to make sure that's secure. Once the two remaining strips are on, I will still go back and press those over and add that stay stitching just as before. I've attached the two remaining strips to the opposite sides of the quilt. I did that stay stitching just inside the folded edge and went ahead and pressed it on the ironing board. So now all that's left to do is to tuck that little overhang that's remaining in. You might need to fold a little bit of that seam allowance in so that it hides. Tuck that in and then fold the whole piece down, making sure that your corner is nice and square. Now of course you may need to manipulate just a little bit to tuck that little extra seam allowance down inside. So simply use your normal basting hand stitching. Typically get it pretty close, about 1/8 of an inch apart to stitch down the facing, and you're done. You notice how the corner is a little bit bulky. If that is a concern for you, you could use a tailor's clapper. A tailor's clapper is used in working on seams like men's suits and so forth, where a lot of those seams come together, where there's welting and so forth. So this is a tailor's clapper. Of course, any hardwood can work. The way that works is simply to hold the seam in place and you strike it with a tailor's clapper. What that does is break down the fibers a little bit in that corner to help those lay nice and flat. Well, let's take a look at one other technique I'll show you that will help reduce a little bit of the bulk here in the corner. It's going to use those triangles I talked to you about at the beginning of the video to treat these a little bit more like you might when you're making a handbag or a shopping bag. We'll lay those triangles over the top here when we're sewing on our facing, and then we won't have to worry quite so much about how all the things come together. So I'm going to do that with the other wall hanging that I've got to show you how that's going to work. With this corner technique, you will take the triangles that you first prepared and you'll lay them on the corner of your quilt first. Then you will add the facing strips to each side, sewing them just as we did before. The one thing you'll need to be careful of is that your facing strips come to about the midway or halfway point of your triangle, or at least are in far enough so that when you turn the triangle back to the back of the quilt, the raw edges will still be covered up. So I'm going to go ahead and attach all 4 sides of my facing strips with the triangle underneath, just as we did before, sewing all the way around the quilt. After you've stitched all the way around, go ahead and stitch diagonally across your corner, because we're going to turn this right side out, and that's going to put some stress on that seam, and that'll help give us some extra stability. And then to help reduce that bulk, kind of like you do when you do binding, go ahead and trim that off, making sure that you're not cutting your stitching. So your extra reinforcement should just be outside the stitching where you turn the corner. Do that on all 4 corners. We still want the facing strips to roll nicely to the back of the quilt. So just like the first example, I'm going to first press these facings away from the raw edge of the quilt, and then I am going to stay stitch all the way along just inside that folded edge, just as we did before. I just finished doing all of the top stitching all the way around the quilt, where that facing is now up. Now I'm going to flip it over with the back side facing me, and do just as I did on the other method by folding this down and helping to get it started with my iron. Still have a little bit of that triangle to fold down too. Then we'll flip the triangle corner to see how to handle pushing that out. It's okay to go ahead and encourage the corner a little bit if you'd like with your iron. Just be careful not to burn yourself. This just helps make the fold a little bit easier. Now that that corner is pressed, all we've got to do is flip it over and encourage that point to come out nice and crisp. And you can use a wooden dowel that's been sharpened but not to a crisp point so that it doesn't poke out the edge, or a traditional bamboo style or plastic point turner. Just going to do our best to encourage that into a nice crisp point. There's also plastic varieties available. Got a few loose threads there, but take a look at how great that looks. So the last step is simply to hand stitch the facing all the way around the quilt. Well, I still have a little bit of handwork to do to sew down all of the facing around each of those panels. But now those panels look fantastic without separate binding kind of stopping your eye. Instead, those mama bears look like they're looking out into infinity. Quilting is great fun, and even though I've been at it for almost 3 decades, I learn something new every day. And I hope today you learn something new too. Be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, check out our APQS YouTube channel, and visit our website at apqs.com. We'd love to have you as part of our APQS family. See you next time.